success. Special thanks to Jackie and Douglas from Fort Space, to Joseph and Javier, I got that right, of the Public Scholar Program, and of course, thanks to our panelists for bringing their view on this really important topic. So please go enjoy the food and talk to each other, and we have the space for a little bit longer now. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. Very special thank you to Stephanie and the panelists for being here today for this conversation and activating the space. Thank you to those who joined us online. We're going to be closing up the live stream and the Zoom, but we'd like to remind you that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it.
We are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And at Fort Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities that examine research questions, projects in development here at the university. We're running this event as a live-streamed Zoom meeting, so we welcome comments and questions with a raised hand or via the chat if you're joining by Zoom. And for those of you here with us in the space, if you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. And with that, it is very much my pleasure to hand it to Concordia Public Scholar, doctoral candidate in physics, Stephanie Tremblay. Stephanie, welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here, either online or here at Fort Space, and welcome to this panel discussion called Reducing the Risk of Neurocognitive Disorder, also called dementia. My name is Stephanie Tremblay, and I will be moderating the panel today. So for those who don't know me, I'm a PhD candidate in physics at Concordia University and a public scholar. And my PhD research focus is to study the brains of people who are at risk of dementia, using MRI to identify early signs of brain abnormalities and thus diagnose diseases that lead to dementia, like Alzheimer's disease, at the earliest stage possible, so at a stage where interventions are more likely to be effective. So one of the populations that I study is cardiovascular patients. So I look at the brains of these patients using MRI. And people are often surprised when I tell them that I study the impact of heart disease on the brain. They tell me like, well, I didn't know this was related. I didn't know that if my cardiovascular health is affected, that this can also affect the health of my brain. So this made me really realize the importance of raising awareness on the different risk factors of dementia. So the goal of today's panel is twofold. The first is to inform and raise awareness on brain health during aging. And we have researchers here today amongst our panelists who specialize in these topics. The second goal is to brainstorm on ways that we can effectively reduce the risk of developing dementia. And so we know what's good for us, why don't we do it? So we have speakers from the field of behavioral science that will help us delve into the why it's so hard to change our lifestyle habits. We also have speakers with a public health perspective to talk about how we can collectively reduce risk through changes in policies and how to make these more accessible to everyone. So I'm delighted to have this panel of experts here today. Let me first introduce Dr. Natalie Phillips. Dr. Phillips is a clinical neuropsychologist and a professor in the Department of Psychology at Concordia University. Her work focuses on cognitive health in aging and dementia. Through her research, she examines the relationship between senses, cognitive abilities, and language processing in older adults. Dr. Phillips is one of the principal developers of the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Tool, or the MOCA, which is a cognitive screening instrument that is used globally for the assessment of mild cognitive impairment. She's also the Associate Scientific Director of the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration in Aging, which is Canada's national research consortium on dementia. So welcome, Dr. Phillips, and thank you for being here today. We also have Dr. Simon Duchesne. Simon is a professor in the Department of Radiology and Nuclear Medicine at Université Laval and researcher at the Quebec Heart and Lungs Institute. He's the leader of the imaging platform for the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration in Aging, and his work focuses on uncovering early biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease using brain imaging and machine learning. His main research goal is to develop techniques that would allow the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease to be made earlier, so ideally several years before the appearance of clinical symptoms. Well, welcome, Dr. Shane, and thank you for being with us today. Then we have Dr. Simon Bacon. Dr. Bacon is a professor in the Department of Health, Kinesiology, and Applied Physiology at Concordia University, and he's also the co-director of the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Center. His research deals with the impact of health behaviors such as physical activity, diet, weight management, and stress on the development and progression of chronic diseases. He also looks at how to design and test interventions to help individuals improve these behaviors. His expertise in leveraging behavioral science to develop better strategies for getting people to engage in health-promoting activities such as exercise and stopping to smoke, for instance, will be especially relevant to the discussion today. So thank you very much, Dr. Bacon, for being with us today. Then we have Dr. Saskia Sivananthan, who is a neuroscientist who specializes in public health and in aging research. She's an affiliate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at McGill University and a former Chief Research and Knowledge Transfer Officer at the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. She's on the Ministerial Advisory Board on Dementia of the Public Health Agency of Canada since 2020. And previously, Dr. Sivananthan also served as a Senior Strategy and Policy Advisor consulting for the World Health Organization. And she advised on its global dementia strategy. She co-drafted the WHO's Global Action Plan on the Public Health Response to Dementia, and she is also co-lead for the inaugural Non-Pharmacological Interventions Working Group of the Canadian Consensus Guidelines on Dementia, who developed the first Canadian recommendations on psychosocial interventions for the management and treatment of dementia. Yes, she has a pretty nice resume, so thank you so much for making the trip here today from Toronto and to be with us today. So please give a warm welcome to all our panelists, and thank you all for accepting to be part of the panel. So I will start with asking you some questions, Dr. Phillips. So we tend to think of memory loss and general cognitive decline as normal parts of aging. Can you tell us a bit more about the aging process, especially how it manifests in the brain, and what differentiates normal, healthy aging from pathological aging?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and this great panel today. I've really been looking forward to it. Really appreciate that you're bringing this topic out for discussion. So, I think one of the key takeaway messages is that the diseases associated with aging and neurodegenerative diseases are just that. They are diseases of the brains. So dementia has many potential causes. Alzheimer's type pathology, Alzheimer's disease is one of them, vascular-related dementia. So these are really not a normal part of aging. They're not an inevitable part of aging, although the biggest risk factor for developing these kinds of diseases is being older, advanced age. So the vast majority of older adults will retain their cognition over their lifespan. I mean, we all get a little bit slower as we get older. Maybe our memory isn't quite as efficient as it used to be, and multitasking is a little bit harder. But those are normal age-related changes in cognition as we get older, and they're very distinct from the kind of precipitous changes that we see associated with neurodegenerative diseases, which, depending on which one you're talking about, is associated with its own characteristic neuropathology. So Alzheimer's disease, for example, is associated with at least 2 different kinds of abnormal proteins that develop in the brain and have a particular distribution in the brain. So that's like one of the main distinctions between a neurodegeneration related disease, and normal aging is they are really pathological processes that happen in the brain. So with normal aging, there are mild changes in the brain. There's some mild atrophy as we get older, but it's quite minimal. There tend to be more significant functional changes, like you tend to see if you look at brain activation studies, more of a shift towards engagement of the frontal regions of the brain. There tends to be more recruitment of the two hemispheres of the brain that is more than what we would see in younger adults. So, but increasingly people also try to think about aging as like not a deficit. Like it's not a comparison necessarily against what young people do, and if it looks different, therefore it's bad, right? I think there is finally a dialogue that's developing around these are normal changes in aging. It doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. They're different than what you see in younger adults.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so clinically, how can we differentiate these two trajectories? So what is a normal decline from something that is pathological? And what are some of the ways that we can identify these people that are on that pathological path, and to identify early enough, right? So I know, and I'm asking clinically, but as I'm thinking about it, maybe like I know a lot of people in the audience are interested in knowing this for personal interest, right? To be able to say like, is my mom, they might be worried about a member of their family and wondering, is this a normal change, or is this something I should be worried about? So
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, and it's really complicated. So there are, as I said, kind of the regular changes that we see with getting older, and everyone has cognitive slips every once in a while. Not that long ago, I booked 2 one-way tickets. It worked out financially to do it that way, but I booked them both in the same direction as opposed to making one. So I think if I was like, I could kind of roll with that because I was like, oh, I'm so busy at work and I just didn't pay attention. But if I were 75, I think that would have worried me a lot more. And I would have seen that as a sign of, oh my God, is that the sign that something serious is going wrong?
Yeah.
And I think, so people do have a lot of anxieties around these very normal cognitive changes. And it's difficult clinically to distinguish them, whether that a normal slip or is that more out of the norm than we would expect. And it's complicated because people present in complicated packages. Somebody goes to their family physician if they have one with some complaints about their memory, but maybe their diabetes medication needs to get tinkered with. Maybe their hypertension hasn't been well controlled. Maybe they've just had a significant loss in the family and they're experiencing some depression. So it's hard to sort all that out. And sometimes the way you sort it out is by watching. And you see, if you can address some of the problems like a depression or blood pressure, in the short run, does the person look better 6 months later? The other thing I would say, there's a huge debate going on now around the criteria for Alzheimer's disease, whether you define it solely by biology, or do you define it by its biology and also having a clinical presentation. So is simply having these proteins, these abnormal proteins in the brain, enough to say that you have Alzheimer's disease, even if you aren't showing the behavioral and cognitive changes yet? And this is a big topic of debate frankly, controversy right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because the last thing I'll say, we do know that about 1/3 of older adults have the kind of pathological changes in the brain that you see in Alzheimer's disease, and they are totally normal. They're functioning well, their cognition is good.
Mm-hmm. Some people show that resilience is something that I've been seeing coming up a lot, that they have those abnormal proteins, but are more resilient because of maybe more cognitive reserve. And so,
That's a possibility, and we could talk about cognitive reserve a little bit later. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. So one of your main areas of research is looking at how certain senses, specifically in this smell and hearing, contribute to cognitive decline. Could you explain why that's an area of interest and how these senses impact the brain?
So we've known for a decade longer, much longer, that there's a relationship between your senses and your cognition, how much you remember, your multitasking. We've known that for decades. Increasingly, there's been a literature, scientific evidence that's developing that shows that individuals with hearing loss, and in other cases olfactory loss, are about 2 times at greater risk for developing dementia, longitudinally. So the question is, why is that? Now, for me as a psychologist, that's a really interesting question for a couple of reasons. The first is, your senses are how you know about the world. If you and I are interacting, it requires my being able to hear you well, being able to see you well, to know that we're getting cues. It requires me being able to get here on a snowy day and navigate, a difficult physical environment. What we know about the world comes in through our senses. So to me, your senses are the input into your brain. So first you need good quality input into the brain. Hearing and olfaction probably have very different reasons why they are associated with a greater risk for dementia. For smell or olfaction, it's the most primitive sense we have, and it's neuroanatomy, the brain regions that mediate or control our sense of smell and our knowledge of smells are the same brain regions involved in dementia like Alzheimer's disease. So brain regions like the hippocampus, which are important for memory, and prefrontal areas. And, this whole system is exactly the same system that's implicated in the development of Alzheimer's disease. So it could be that olfaction is like an early canary in the coal mine. So when that system begins to deteriorate, you see it through loss of olfactory performance.
It would be just another consequence of the pathological process, of the disease process.
Yeah, and for the longest time I thought about, that's how I thought about it, although now I'm really beginning to think about how, and we heard about this during the pandemic, how your sense, when people have a loss of sense of smell, people really talk about their world as being kind of colorless and bland and uninteresting. And it's like, things don't feel right in my world when I don't have when I can't smell. So I think there actually are likely behavioral and dietary and nutritional changes that could accompany a sense of a loss of smell, and we're going to try to look at some of that in some data that we have. So like I said, I used to think of it as just the canary in the coal mine, but now I'm not so sure. I think it's more than that. For hearing, it's complicated because the relationship between hearing loss and your cognition and developing dementia, it could be that they share the same biology. You've got the same kind of genes or processes of inflammation, vascular changes that contribute to hearing loss, contribute to brain health. Maybe they just go down at the same time. I don't think it's that simple. Another possible reason is the one that I alluded to, getting, hearing is such a vital sense for us as communicative people. And so getting, we know that when you're in a difficult listening environment, like if this were a noisy environment, or think about being at a cocktail party, where it's like, I'm really trying hard to listen. We know that you recruit additional brain areas to help resolve that very difficult task. And it's possible that over the long term that results in reorganization in the brain and maybe a loss of this cognitive reserve that you mentioned before. And then a third reason could be, and we know this really well, that many people who have a hearing loss can withdraw from social situations. So there's can be higher levels of depression, some changes in your social network. So you think about someone who says, I just can't go to the family holiday party because everybody's going to be talking, it's too effortful, I can't keep up with the conversation, I'm too tired to do it. And so people with a significant hearing loss can start to drop out of some of the social situations that would have been very stimulating and supportive to them. So it could be any one of those three reasons. It's probably all three of them working in combination.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was super insightful. We'll move on to our second panelist.
Where were you going? Twice.
Where was I? Oh, Halifax. I was going to Halifax. I've also learned if you show up to get your boarding pass and they say, we cannot issue, the machine says we cannot issue your boarding pass, please present yourself to the desk. That's not a good sign either. You've also done something wrong.
I hope you realized before getting to the airport that you would.
No, not in that case.
Okay. So, Dr. Shane, your work focuses on finding early biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. I'd like to know how early can we actually detect Alzheimer's disease in the brain, and also why is early detection so important?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation again. Also, thank you people for being here, those that actually made it to Concordia, those that are online. Can't really see the people online, so I assume that you guys are there. Thank you for taking the time tuning in. This will be rebroadcast, right? For posterity, so you better watch what I say. I guess I'm just going to continue where you started. What can we see and how early can we see it? I think why we want to see things early is relatively simple to understand. Like any disease, cancer, for example, the sooner you see it, the more you can act on it. You could even cure cancers, some cancers, if you are fast enough. In the brain, unfortunately, we don't have any good outside repair mechanisms. It's still science fiction to take a new brain, put it in your old skull, and start again. So we need, the earlier we are, the more we can act on it and therefore prevent the disease to happen in the first place. So that's why we want to do this. How early can we do it? Well, I have to come back to, I'll have to make a big parenthesis because we have to decide what is the disease. If we don't know what it is, we don't know what to look for. So this is about dementia. I'll be talking only about Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease is one of the many diseases that cause dementia, like Nathalie mentioned. It is present in about 2/3 of dementia, so it's your run of, that's why people confuse Alzheimer's and dementia, because it's almost synonymous. If we have time, especially for you, we could talk about vascular disease, cerebral vascular disease. This is also the second most prevalent, the most often occurring cause of dementia. Well, let's go back to, and without all due respect to every patient out there, Others like Lewy body and Parkinson do occur, of course, semantic dementia and like that, but they occur much less frequently, and therefore they represent different kinds of diseases. So I think it'll be fun if I'm a bit polemic, right? Especially because what is Alzheimer's? Nathalie mentioned a debate, so I don't know, I'll take the bad part of the debate. It is not amyloid. There, I said it. What is amyloid? So Nathalie was mentioning proteins. If you Google Alzheimer, you will have this second word pop up, amyloid. So it's a protein, it's in the brain. We actually don't have a full grasp of what it does, actually. It's one of the many, many, many billions of proteins that are being done. But this one happens in our brain, clumps up. If your brain was a car, it's like rust. It gets everywhere, eventually. And people with Alzheimer's dementia have the rust, they have the protein. So much so that now the field, like Nathalie is mentioning, is defining Alzheimer's dementia as the presence of amyloid, as the presence of the rust. So if you have it, you have the disease. So far so good. How fast can we see it? We can image it now in the brain out as you're alive. 5, 10, 15, maybe in some cases 20 years before. There's actually evidence that people accumulated from their 20s. And therefore, we could be very, very early. So if it were that simple, then it'd be very simple. You figure out if you have amyloid, and now we have drugs. You will have probably seen in the press that there's drugs that can remove amyloid. Give the drug, no more amyloid. The drugs actually work. They do remove amyloid. And the problem should go away. And we wouldn't be here today, right? Not that simple. So there's no question that amyloid exists, and we have any theory will need to explain what it's doing there. Your car will rust. But it's not a sufficient condition for your car not to run. There are cars that are very, very rusty and they still function. Like Nathalie mentioned, I don't want to equate being rusty with being older, but as with time we accumulate age, and age comes with all kinds of things. So fully 1/3 of people, of seniors 65 and over, have amyloid in their brain. Not just amyloid in the brain, amyloid at the pathological level, at the level of that we say, oh, this should be the same level as being demented. Yet they are not, have no clinical problems whatsoever. Contrarily, there's quite a few people with clinical dementia that do not have amyloid either. So it's neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition to get Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Nobody, to give you another example, nobody could survive without insulin. Nobody with insulin does not have diabetes. This is it. If you don't have it, you have diabetes. You need it. Amyloid is not the same case, right? So if you don't have perfusion in your brain, if you don't have a good cerebrovascular system, you will get a cognitive deficit. If you cannot process energy well in your brain, you will get a cognitive deficit. But if you have amyloid, you may carry on. Why am I saying this? Again, going back to how early can we spot it? Well, like I said, we can spot amyloid very early. We'll talk about cures and drugs later. But it's not enough. So what else can we track? Well, we can track atrophy. We can track your neurons, the cells in your brain, start to die. And that we can start tracking quite early, but it's not sensitive. It's not specific. You can lose quite a lot of your brain and still function. We can also track the use of your energy. Again, very sensitive, but it starts to overlap a lot with what would be, quote, normal aging. So 5, 10 years before, the picture starts to get really muddy from the time that people have a diagnostic. 5 years before, you can find pretty good evidence that, you will get something that will likely affect your cognition. We'll call this dementia. 10 years it gets muddy, and 15 years I would say that we're still not able to do it. But that's primarily because we don't understand exactly what's going on in the brain, period. We don't understand all of the parts of the car, how they all fit together, and how you can drive from A to B.
Yeah, so like a lot more work has to be done on really defining the disease and the biomarkers that would be useful.
Yes.
Now could you tell us a bit more on which factors actually determine whether someone will develop Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia? So we know there are some risk factors. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, this will depend quite exactly on my previous answer, which was not answering your question, right? So I successfully avoided answering your question. If we knew what caused dementia, then we could act on it. What are risk factors for amyloid? We know there are 3 genes that, when they are mutated, will give you so much amyloid that you cannot escape it. There's a limit to having rust in the car. If every part is really punched through, it'll just fall apart. That's basically the status. This is the familial form of Alzheimer's. Touches less than 3%, depending on the study, less than 3% of people with dementia. If you had this gene, you would know. Your parents would have been demented in their 40s and probably gone by the time they were in their early 50s. So people with that, they know. So it's not what the vast majority of people experience. Other genes affecting Alzheimer's, there's probably 20 of them in the literature. None of them give the disease. They increase your risk of having the disease. Those are what we would call non-modifiable risk factors. You cannot yet modify your genes, right? There's some technologies where we can start envisioning this in the not so far future, but not yet applied to this. Other non-modifiable factors, sex is one. Sex is a proxy of a bunch of things, and I won't even go into gender. So there's more women than men that have Alzheimer's disease. We don't fully understand why. Is it a truly genetic issue? Is it the life course of a female through including menopause and therefore hormonal? Is it an interaction with gender in a straight woman? And all that we still don't understand. What I would also put in non-modifiable factor when you're 75 is your education when you were young. You can't go back in time. And this also seems to have an effect later in life. But again, is it the education itself or the life that it gives you? And the way we measure education right now is in school years, which frankly, I'm reading a biography of Benjamin Franklin, did not finish high school. He was a well-accomplished gentleman. So education is a construct again. So, but still, there's something there that's a risk factor. The rest of the risk factors that we know from looking at the vast populations that have had Alzheimer's will be no surprise to all of you. It's stuff that you know that make life enjoyable. Sugar and alcohol and fat. So basically, if you're hypertense, if you're diabetic, if you smoke, if you are sedentary, if you start living in isolation, those are all risk factors that have been associated with Alzheimer's disease and dementia in general. And we know what to do for that. We know how to treat hypertension. We know how not to get hypertense. Same for diabetes, same for obesity. We know about smoking. We know about not being sedentary. So we can, I think Simon will be touching on why we're not doing it. But those are the risk factors. There's no magical risk factor hidden out there that will give you dementia. But those are risk factors again. You could live a perfectly monastic life and still get demented. But in the realms of things that we can control, those diminish your risk of Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm. So it's really the combination of all those risks that at the population level we'll see lower prevalence, but
combination is important, if I may. The more you have, the higher the risk. So they obviously interact with each other, which again is no surprise. But it also makes the more you have, the more critical it should be for you to act on it. Right?
Yeah.
I didn't mention hearing loss. We'll come back on when the time comes for cures and trials, and but hearing loss is, and therefore sensory loss probably in general, is now a known risk factor for dementia.
Thanks so much. One last question. Can you tell us a bit about the intervention studies that have been done in Canada, but also especially worldwide? Started with the Finnish study, fingers, and then expanded. Can you tell us a bit about these and what they can teach us about in terms of prevention strategies and their effectiveness?
So I'm not a clinician, I'm an engineer by training. I don't see patient, I'm not a doctor, so everything I've said you are taking with a grain of salt. Nathalie actually knows a lot also on intervention studies, my colleagues as well. There's been two kinds. There's been quite a few kinds, but two big classes, drugs and non-drugs. Let's put it this way. The drug ones have almost all been unsuccessful. I'll refer back to my previous answer. Because we don't know what the disease is exactly, we don't know what molecule, what protein to address exactly and how to stop this cascade. The most well-known of them all is the amyloid protein. There's been at least 50 trials in humans, late-stage trials. Those are quite involved trials of thousands of people, billions of dollars to stop the production of amyloid, stop the accumulation, stop everything about amyloid. They've all failed up to the last 3 years, where one way to address amyloid was found, which is basically to tell your body to generate to teach your body to generate antibodies to find amyloid and take it out. So those have been very successful. Again, they remove the rust from your car, almost brand new car. Is it running more efficiently? Well, it turns out that statistically speaking, and especially if you're a white male, yes, it does. For 6 months. So the longest trial right now is about 18 months, so it did not stop decline, it slowed decline by roughly 6 months. I refer back to my skeptic stance on amyloid again. When we give insulin to a diabetic, it stops the problem. You can carry on. This obviously, even though it was early in the disease, removing amyloid did not stop decline. So obviously it's there. It does some effect, but it's not enough. If it was also as simple as taking a pill, I would be saying, well, sure. What's the harm? Well, it turns out that it's a costly proposition. Quite literally, we're talking $25,000 US per year. So this is not a trivial matter in a socialist healthcare system like ours. It also brings, you cannot give it to everybody because there's quite a lot of side effects that come with it, especially in terms of the vasculature of your brain can get negatively affected. So you basically have small strokes, very tiny point-form strokes that happen, which is very bad and result in immediate cessation of treatment. So that's the drug part. The non-drug part is also involves drugs, to be honest, but it's basically, let's figure out all those risk factors. Let's be very aggressive about all of your health problems. Let's be aggressive about your diabetes, your hypertension. Let's be very aggressive about you moving, so that we and make sure you do exercise, physical exercise. We'll make sure you do mental exercise also. So you activate, and you not just activate, you also find strategies to cope with decline. We also want, in figure? Not in figure.
No.
Well, soon enough. So those are the studies that started 7 years ago and gave results 3-4 years ago. The last one was nutrition also, to keep you, there's things you need to stop doing and things you need to do better, right? So nutrition, good nutrition is something you need to do better. So when you do that, you actually also lessen decline by roughly the same proportion, with no side effect whatsoever. Last one, hearing is another one. As the community was hearing about the new amyloid drug being presented this summer in a conference, the next day there was a study on hearing aids that was also being presented that resulted in roughly similar effects just from having hearing aids and solving your hearing loss problem. Now, it did not have the same amount of people included, and therefore statistically it's not a done deal, but there's no side effect. It costs $6,000 for 5 years, and it's actually enjoyable because you hear more and better. So all those things need to be considered when we talk about cures, not cures, I don't want to say cures, when we talk about prevention strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those prevention strategies addressing those risk factors, so although not perfectly equitable, we'll talk about that a little bit later, they're more accessible, right, than those drugs, which makes them interesting. Thank you so much. Hi.
Is this on?
Yes. So Dr. Bacon, we've alluded to this a little bit earlier already, but we know that these behaviors like eating well, exercising, not smoking, we know that these things are good for us. And most people are very aware of this, maybe a little bit less about the impact of these habits on the brain, but everyone knows at least that this is good for their heart, their lungs, and so on. So why don't we do it? Why is it so hard to change our lifestyle habits?
Thank you very much. And once again, to echo the other comments, thanks for the invitation, thanks for it's on, also to the fourth space. It's an amazing space here, so wonderful to be here. And I'm glad that you start with the easy questions, and then we can just progress to the more hard ones. Okay, so there are many different reasons with any individual why they don't start or maintain a behavior. And I think it's important, I'm going to talk about both separately. Starting a behavior is one aspect, and then actually maintaining a behavior is a different aspect. That being said, it is quite a complex web, but it normally comes down to a couple of key elements. So, once you've started trying to change a behavior, why do you give up? And that's probably the one that racks most people's brains as to, they made the effort, why can't they maintain it? And it normally comes down to sort of basically two things. One is around an expectation about what the behavior will do for them. Right? So quite often we have these very unrealistic ideas about how our world is suddenly going to be so spectacular because this behavior is suddenly going to make everything wonderful. And behavior change is a slow process. The benefits of behavior change are a long-term gain. But we're in a world where we get sold the quick fix. If you look at as a parallel, you look at the top 10 selling books every year, invariably 8 out of 10 are going to be diet books, all professing that you're going to be able to have this amazing X body lifestyle by doing this one thing, and you're going to be able to do it in 6 weeks. Right? And that's just not realistic, but people have some of those expectations. So number one, it's an expectation about what the behavior's going to do for them that's not met. So it's an unrealistic expectation about that. The other is an unrealistic expectation about what you can do. And of course, when you start changing a behavior, you're full of enthusiasm. Something sparked this reason, you're just like, yeah, I'm just gonna jump into this. And I'm gonna, change everything, and it's all gonna happen, and I'm gonna be able to do all of this. And the reality is that life's way too complicated. So if you have an unrealistic expectation about, the changes you're gonna be able to make, and how quickly you can be able to make those changes, and you don't achieve them, then, that creates this sort of disappointment, and that's, another reason why most people give up. So probably the specific factors within any individual will vary, but they normally come down to one of those two things if you start to change your behavior. The flip side of that is obviously starting the behavior. So a lot of people just don't start behavior change. And, why is it they don't start behavior change? Generally, it comes down to the actual lack of personal relevance for them. And we can sit here and philosophize about how important all these things are, and on a population level they absolutely are, on an individual they absolutely are. But when you talk to someone personally, what is important to them, and sometimes those things aren't consistent. And there's a whole series of reasons why that might be. They might not understand that this is a behavior that actually translates directly to a problem that they have that's actually going to fix it. They may not feel particularly motivated to, engage in those kind of behaviors. It may be fantastic for them, but they're just not interested. And the other area is normally that they just don't know how to change that behavior, right? It's just not, exercise. What does that mean? How am I supposed to do that? So that's a large part of it. The other part, and then that sort of translates itself into sort of ambivalence. So what's ambivalence? It's sort of having both positive and negative feelings about something. So a lot of us live in ambivalence all the time. If we don't do a behavior, but we know it's a good behavior, right? I really want to exercise, but I can't find the time. Right? That's the perfect definition of ambivalence. So it's not relevant enough to us to actually do it, but we're really good at then describing why we shouldn't do it, right? And so that's normally the reason why people don't start. And then once they do start, the reason why they stop is normally through that sort of unrealistic expectations piece.
Thank you so much. And what are some of the strategies that can be used to get people to engage in those health promoting activities? I know you do some work in that space, working with healthcare professionals.
No, thank you. Yeah. What I'm going to say, changing behavior is easy conceptually. Changing behavior in context is difficult, and that's where it's gets a little bit more tricky. Clearly, if I had the magic sauce, I'd be a billionaire by now. So we're still trying to work this out. So that's my caveat up front. That being said, still not rich. No. I wish, but no, still an academic, therefore not rich. Yeah. I think, so what are some of the things we can do? So that's a really important question. So the first is, unsurprisingly, shifting the expectations. So if you're going to start a behavior, so I'm going to talk about the two examples as well, right? So I want to start changing a behavior. So one of the first things to do, so two things that are really actually quite important in behavior change. Number one is understand the behavior that you're doing at this moment in time. So I'll give you a good example. Two of the easiest ones, physical activity and dietary change, right? So all of us are physically active, so we get up and do things. We're probably just not active enough, maybe. And all of us eat. That's pretty straightforward. So the first thing you need to do is understand, well, what is my actual behavior that I'm doing right now? And most of us are actually really bad at doing that. If I was to ask, if I was to ask anybody in the audience here, tell me how many calories you ate and what those calories consisted of, probably nobody would be able to do that. I couldn't do that, to be honest, at this point in time. So, before you start changing a behavior, you really have to understand the behavior that you're engaging in this moment in time. So that's really important. The second part of it is goal setting. and a very structured way of goal setting. And in the literature, these two have been shown time and time again to be really important cornerstones. Not the only things, but really important cornerstones. So this comes back to the expectation part, right? So what is it I want to do? Well, I want to be more physically active. Why do you want to be more physically active? I'm going to run a marathon. Okay, even for me, that's not realistic. I don't think I'll ever run a marathon. And if that's my goal, and I'm starting from someone that I really am not particularly active at this moment in time, that's a tough thing to achieve. Not impossible, but maybe that's not the starting point, right? And so what you want to do is break down that goal, and there's this thing called the SMART goals. So specific, measurable, realistic, attainable, and timed, relevant and timed, sorry. And so, you want that goal to be something you can do. You want to say, I'm going to, if I want to be more physically active, okay. So I know how much physical activity I'm doing at this moment in time, because I measured it, and self-monitored, I understand what I'm doing. I'm going to increase 5 minutes a day. And I'm going to do that for the next month. Okay, so SMART. Okay, I can walk 5 minutes more a day. I can find ways of doing that and building that into my lifestyle. Measurable. Yep, I can actually note down every day where I've had it my 5 minutes. Achievable. Yeah, I've got all the things that I need to be able to do it. Is it realistic? Yes, I can build that into my schedule. And I know that I need to do it in the next month. So just, those are two really important cornerstones. There's more things that have to layer on top of that. But if you can start with those two pieces, they're pretty good tools on an individual level that actually become, nice building blocks. And then, obviously SMART goals, once you've achieved that goal, you can start planning for bigger goals. And that's actually how eventually you build up to being able to do the marathon.
Yeah, so having these realistic goals and also knowing your starting point is what I'm taking away. And you mentioned it a little bit already, but it's one thing to start a new behavior, but it's another one to maintain it. So what are some of those key factors that determine whether someone will be able to maintain these new lifestyle habits or stick to their New Year's resolution?
Yeah. New Year's resolutions are, that's another conversation we might have time for. But so when you start, so one of the biggest things actually that once you've started the behavior and you've got into a rhythm of the behavior, so really critical. Going back to the SMART goal, always think about your life and how it is at this moment in time, right? And really think about how do I integrate that goal into the everyday. That's really important. But okay, so you're doing it, you've integrated it, you go Why is it people kind of fall off the wagon? Well, that's actually why is not that complicated. This just happens to everybody. I teach in a department that's effectively a kinesiology department that lots of people do lots of physical activity, and whenever I teach, do you do physical activity? Yes. Would you say you're an athlete? Yes. Do you say you always do physical activity? Yes. Okay. Do you have ever had a day where you just didn't do physical activity? Oh yeah. But you still consider yourself someone who's physically active and doing it all the time? Yeah. And that's the key, right? When you're changing a behavior and you get into a bit of a rhythm and it's an unusual behavior because you haven't done it for a long time or you're just starting it and so on, if you get into this rhythm and then you stop doing it, for whatever reason, it's called a lapse. That's the critical point. And how you think about that lapse and how you deal with that lapse will invariably decide whether you maintain the behavior or whether you stop the behavior. So there's a really important element of forgiveness that you have to kind of learn, because having a lapse is normal. Everyone has them. Whatever behavior you're trying to change, you're never going to do it perfectly all the time. And so one of the biggest hints there is that when you have that lapse, acknowledge the lapse and be like, okay, so I'm a human being, that's okay. Now, what's my plan to get back to going to the behavior? And how much leeway do I have to give myself? Sometimes if you're physically active and you get sick and it knocks you out for a week, And you're like, well, I was active, but now I'm not. And having that sort of dichotomous thinking is really problematic. But, then your trick is to say, okay, so how do I start again? How do I get back? Okay, let me get back to the basics and let me start building back up and start putting it back in. The other one that's, very common with anything, being busy. All of us have lifestyles generally that with too many things going on, we're all too busy. And that, even spreads into post-retirement and into old age. We manage to fill our time with things. And it gets in the way of doing stuff. And so, being realistic about the goals, but then busyness ebbs and flows. So sometimes you get to this week where it's like, oh, I've got to be here, I've got to do that thing, I'm traveling over there, I'm not going to be able to eat a healthy diet, I'm not going to be able to, do my activity. Okay, so that's a lapse. It's a circumstance that is unique. Give yourself that forgiveness and then go, okay, how do I get back to this? So that, so that's one of the key things, that's pretty critical.
Yeah. So that forgiveness, that ability to just be, okay, this happened, now let's find a way to go back. Yeah.
Exactly. And go back to the basics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bacon. Okay, so Dr. Sivananthan, our last speaker. So we've heard already about some of the obstacles more on the individual level, but we know that some of these changes in lifestyle behavior are not necessarily equally accessible to everyone. Could you speak a little bit to the obstacles that could be due to social economic inequalities, systemic issues, or perhaps also inequities in our healthcare system?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and this is a great panel, and I already have questions for all of you. But also, thank you for starting with the really hard questions, Tiffany. I actually want to go back a minute because we talked a bit about risk factors, and we really touched on them at an individual level, right? We're telling each person that these are lifestyle changes that can change your overall risk of developing dementia. It's not a guarantee that you won't get it. It's not a guarantee that you will get it if you're unhealthy and you don't do any of these things. But a lot of my world is at a population level. So it's a different perspective when you're looking at it that way. You're looking at a whole number of people and what happens when you collectively look at those risk factors. And that's where we're seeing a lot of excellent and good evidence around how changing the risk for a whole population around exercising, diet, etc., can have an impact on the number of people who will develop dementia. And so that's where you do hear the statistic, 40% of dementias could be prevented, and that's used in that way, but really only at a population level. That doesn't mean individually that that's what happens. It means it adds up to being able to do that. So I think that's an important distinction because I agree that there's accountability that we can take and there are things that we can change in our lives. But then going back to your question, there are pieces that we can't. And it's important to acknowledge that context, right? And this comes back to some of the questions about inequity. So I'll go about it in a bit of a roundabout way, but we'll talk about some populations and groups and communities who are at higher risk of dementia and why they might be at higher risk. So there's a report that will be coming out soon and some work that I did when I was at the Alzheimer's Society where we looked at that in Canada. You know, are there populations? What will it be over the next 20 to 30 years? Will the demographics of the people who are living with dementia look the same? And what will that be? And no surprise, there's going to be a shift. There's going to be a change in who will be developing dementia over the next 30 years. We're going to see a big increase in people of Asian descent, actually, who will be living with dementia, a significant one. But also, the risk factors are different in different communities. And some of it relates back to ethnicity and then a whole host of other things. So the literature has touched on and looked quite a bit at Indigenous communities, for example, and Black communities who are at higher risk of developing dementia. And there's a host of reasons for them. A lot of them have to do with the risk factors that were just touched on. but it also relates back to something we call social factors, basically. Social determinants of health is the term that's used in the literature. And these are things that might not be health related, but impact your health. So things like housing, food security, unemployment, air pollution, things that might not be within your control as an individual, but impact your risk. So I'll give you an example. We talk a lot about diet, and one of the recommendations is something similar to a Mediterranean diet is a good diet to follow. And what that basically means is, you up your vegetable fruit intake, whole grains, beans, and fish. Right, that's sort of the ideal diet. And there's a really interesting documentary that's also looked at areas around the world that are called blue zones. And these are communities that seem to have better longevity in terms of aging and don't seem to be dealing with as much cognitive impairment and dementia as you would expect given the aging population. And so they've looked at different factors, including diet being a part of that. Now, if anyone has gone to the grocery store recently, there's significant changes in what you can afford. And if you are someone who is maybe working multiple jobs, living in an environment where you don't have easy access to fish, even as an example, is not an easily accessible produce or product. It's expensive. Fresh versus farmed, there are all of these factors that can come into play. And so we can tell someone, change your diet, and then there's all the behavioral aspects of that, but also it just might not be accessible for them. So that's one of the ways of looking at it. Another has been sort of more systemic, organizational aspects that might impact a community or a person's risk. So racism and colonialism has been linked now and been shown to impact communities and have legacy impact on communities. And so the Indigenous community is an example of that. For example, first of all, there's not a lot of literature and a lot of data understanding what Indigenous communities are living with when it comes to dementia, but some of the data that is there shows that, for example, people from First Nations communities are up to 35% higher risk than non-Indigenous. And so some of the potential reasons for some of that could be increased risk related to diabetes, hypertension, insecure housing, insecure food, and a legacy of trauma. Another, for example, is education. It's a non-modifiable risk factor. Of course, you can't go back in time and change your education. But if you think that, it was only fairly recently that residential schools stopped, that's a legacy that would have continued for Indigenous people who have lived through that, and that trauma that might carry forward and impact education and a whole host of other conditions. So that's some of the ways to also think about your risk of developing dementia and the sorts of inequities that could be faced that way. And then if you look at the US literature, there's a lot within Black communities, and again, similar sorts of trauma and racism that can impact a person's risk that they don't have control over more immediately.
Mm-hmm. So more work to be done in that area.
Yes.
And in your opinion, what can be done in terms of policy to promote the implementation of risk-reducing strategies and also to ensure that these strategies can reach people from underprivileged populations? If we think of a place like Quebec, for instance.
That's a great question, because I think some of these are things that could be impacted from broader population policies, and then there are others that are more individual and motivational, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more. But a very high, something that should be high on the priority list from my perspective, and this is just from daily interactions with people who are living with dementia, and Alzheimer's disease, when I was at the Alzheimer's Society, is stigma and awareness. So even when we're talking about dementia, we're talking about the brain, there's not a lot of awareness around how our brain functions, the interaction between our brain and our bodies, and that more holistic view of who we are. And I think understanding that better and reducing that stigma around dementia, about being demented. Oh my God, people think I'm going to be crazy. So I'm not going to tell anyone, and I'm certainly going to hide as much as I can that I might be forgetting or that these things are slipping, because there's such stigma associated with that. And if older age is certainly, one of the higher, you're at higher risk of developing dementia as you get older. But even when you might be a little bit younger, we touched on that, Natalie and Simon did, dementia is an umbrella term, right? There's up to 100 different forms of diseases that live under that umbrella. And frontal temporal dementia, for example, is a type of dementia that tends to impact a bit younger, people who might be in their 50s and who might be working. So again, the stigma of, now I'm not able to work and I have maybe younger kids that I have to take care of as well. And so from a public health perspective, when we think about dementia, I'd say this is one of the things that we really need to work on. And other diseases have done that very successfully. HIV, AIDS, cancer. When these diseases were first coming to the forefront, there was a huge stigma around it. No one wanted to talk about it, acknowledge it. They didn't want to deal with it. And there had to be a lot of public health policies and pushes and education and awareness before we were able to tackle it. And then with that came more treatments and more hope around, okay, I might have this disease, and maybe there's not going to be some immediate silver bullet or cure, but there are things that I can still do, and there's ways that I'm still a part of my community. And that's, I think, part of what we really need to look at as well when it comes to dementia. Now, I didn't answer your question, though, because I'll go back to that, which is really around risk factors. And the reason I brought up the awareness is because the earlier we understand these risk factors and how they impact us, and how the other thing about those risk factors is it's not just dementia. They cut across a whole host of other chronic diseases, so diabetes, hypertension, heart and stroke. It's the same sort of risk factors. Being sedentary, not having a healthy diet, social isolation, all of these things are linked. And so we need to, I think about health policies that are, again, more holistic. And some countries are doing them well. Other countries are starting to get there. And so I'll give you an example. Finland, for example, has really developed a brain health strategy. And it's multi-pronged in that it's not centered on health alone. And that's part of what you heard from the other panelists as well, that a disease like dementia or any other chronic disease, it's because we think of it as a disease, we think of it as health only. But really, we need to think of it from a social dimension, from a housing dimension, from an accessibility dimension. And when you start looking at it that way, you're able to develop policies that address the need of the person. So one of the policies that they've started really building has been more social inclusion. How do you include older adults, people who are at higher risk, more in their community so that they're more engaged, they feel motivated, they have a sense of purpose. Your life is not done when you're older and you're retired and you have nothing more to give. That's not what it is. How do we continue to engage and make the community accessible to them? And when you make it accessible to them, you're making it accessible to everyone. So they really started to think about brain health that way as well. An easy win is hearing aids, and we've talked about that a little bit, and Natalie's really the expert, but I think that's a short-term easy gain. If we made hearing aids easy to access, they were covered under your health system, and good hearing aids, because there's varying qualities, and then again, you lose motivation if you can't hear well, there's background noise, you stop using them. my husband's grandmother is an example of that. You know, we've tried like 4 hearing aids, and she just takes them aside because she's like, I can't hear you. I'm like, but that's the point of the hearing aid. But it's because the hearing aid's not been tweaked properly to meet her need. And then once you found the right one, it opened up her world. And so I think that might be more of a short-term policy, but in the longer-term policy, awareness raising, education, stigma reduction, thinking about dementia and these risk factors not from a health-only perspective, but really thinking about it much more holistically. When we wrote the Global Action Plan on Dementia, we called it a public health plan, and the reason for that was we didn't want everything to be centered on the medical system and looking at it from a health-only perspective, but really to get all of government to work collectively on policies that can impact dementia. And so the evidence is starting to come out, and different countries are at different stages where they're better able to do that. But there's a culture change that I think also needs to happen from a public perception to be able to enable better policy development.
I really agree on what you're saying about not seeing it as only a health issue, but as something wider than that, and knowing that those inequalities lead to this risk not being distributed equally, really raises the importance of addressing those inequities, and that's a larger problem. Can you tell us a bit about the broader impact that a disease like dementia has in our society, so beyond obviously the impact on the people that are directly affected by the disease?
Thank you. That's an important question. You know, we think about dementia and we think about a person who's living with this disease, but often, as you know, as the disease progresses, you need a care partner, and that may or may not be a family member. But if you have family, certainly your family is also going to be touched by this. And then it really spreads even broader than that, because dementia, again, is not just a health concern. It impacts your ability to do your finances, to be able to drive and get around to your appointments, to meeting your friends. Because of the stigma of it, now your friends might no longer want to meet with you or invite you because they're not sure what to say. And how do they deal if you forget something and they don't want to remind you, right? Those are some of the aspects of it as well. And then there's housing, because again, as the disease progresses, the person is less able to take care of themselves and their daily needs. There's going to be accessibility issues with a house. And then even after you address those, it might get to the point where that daily care cannot be provided by your loved one or your care partner. So it has huge financial implications as well as health implications. And there's also a lot of data that looks at that care partner, that person who is helping the person living with dementia navigate not just the health system, but their dementia journey. And there's a lot to show that their stress levels increase. In order to be able to take care of the person who has dementia, they often put aside their own health needs and they don't deal with those. So those then start building up, and then they start needing to use the health system, and they themselves might become someone who needs a caregiver as well. And then there's very much the financial implication of dementia. We don't talk a lot about it because a lot of dementia and the care for dementia is unpaid, it's unseen. It's things like helping someone bathe, helping them change, setting up all of their appointments so that they can go see the neurologist and then go see the cardiologist and go see their GP who has to coordinate all of this, and then the imaging that needs to get done, and then the blood work that you need to do. It takes time, and especially when you have dementia, the ability to get to all of those places takes much more planning, and so that labor is unseen and often we call it unpaid labor. By these caregivers, and that has huge implication because a lot of those caregivers are women, or usually female members of the community, And there's a sort of a trickle-down effect, because in order to provide that care, now maybe they step away a little bit from their work. They might reduce their hours, they might not take promotions because that means more responsibility and they might not have the time to be able to take that on. It means they have young children potentially as well, so now they're trying to manage care for their aging parents or in-laws or older family members, as well as their young children. There are all of these implications that we haven't fully thought through or understand, but we lean on right now because we don't provide the social network and the supports or the benefits for them. So I think those are some of the longer term impacts that, again, if we don't take a holistic view to thinking about dementia and the kinds of supports that need to be provided, not just for people with dementia, but for care partners and families, we're going to get to the point where there's such burnout and such a stretched system that something's going to break.
Mm-hmm. So that would be a big challenge to address in the coming years. So now I'd like to open the discussion a little bit to all the panelists. Just have some questions that any of you can pitch in the yes. So the first one is, what are, in your opinion, the key solutions in preventing a dementia epidemic, or at least decrease its extent by delaying as many cases as possible?
Could I just?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a simple question. I'm going to pick up on a word that you used, and it's in the title actually over here, and that's epidemic. And I have very conflicted feelings about that word. I think it's a useful word to raise awareness and to get people's attention about the seriousness of dementia and the fact that with an aging population, so we know, 2016 was the first time the proportion of people over the age of 65 was more than the people over the age of 14. So we have all Western cultures have an aging population. So this is a really, really, really significant issue, and we need to get government attention. Like dementia was mentioned in the mandate letter to the Minister of Health in 2019 for the first time. And that was very exciting to see, very gratifying to people in the reassuring. Do you think it appeared in the mandate letter to the Minister of Health in 2020? No. Like, guess what happened in 2020? So there actually was a pandemic, an epidemic. So I think it's useful for getting people's attention, for convincing the seriousness of the issue, but I think it also has a pejorative sense to it as well. And we were talking earlier about stigma and shame, and I think these are really important issues that we have to, that we also have to consider. I have to say ageism is the last ism that we have out there. Sexism, I mean, not that these things have been addressed, but racism, sexism, but you can still easily find greeting cards that mock people who are older. So I think this is a barrier to making advances in this area. It's probably a barrier to fundraising as well. So I don't have a great answer for you, but I do twig on that word quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you for your input.
So I'm actually going to circle back to the policy and systems issue, and it's not just here within the context of dementia. I mean, I just think generally across the board from a healthcare perspective in Quebec. You talk about this thing being a problem down the line. We're living this problem right now. So here's how broken the system is, right? The issues we're having in our emergency departments at the moment it's not actually, the biggest problem is not actually people coming to the emergency department. The biggest problem is getting people out of the emergency department. And dementia is a perfect example, right? So people with dementia have a higher probability of having accidents and falls, etc., and going to end up in the emergency department. Now, for the emergency department to discharge that person, because they have dementia, they have to be sent somewhere. They can't leave on their own volition. Well, if they don't have a caregiver, they don't have a support system, what happens? They stay in the hospital. But we don't have enough beds in the hospital, so it clogs the ED, right? So you see there's a system issue here we have that's really problematic. So we need a strong rethink around policy. I love the point about policy at all levels, right? I mean, you know, the systemic racism that we have within Quebec that's not acknowledged by our current government is critically important, because you have to, you know, acknowledge the problem. Then you can find solutions. Changing those kind of structures and trying to address those kind of issues through policy and system change becomes fundamentally important, because if you have better systems, you have healthier individuals, you have more functional individuals, that then solves a whole series of problems down the line. Biggest issue, biggest barrier to this, of course, is from a political perspective, you've got to put a lot of time, energy, and effort and dollars into that for a reward that's only going to come to full fruition 10, 15 years from now. You'll make small gains, but really the big bang for the buck is there. And obviously political life cycles are only 4 years. So that's where the bit of the tension becomes in trying to actually enact those solutions.
I'm not sure if we're all supposed to talk, but I'll jump in. I just want to come back to your question. Those are all valid points about avoiding the non-epidemic epidemic. So you mentioned reducing dementia risk. I'll talk about the future. The present is already complicated as it is, and people that have a diagnostic right now, the available treatments are not perfect. And in the future, we know the best available evidence we have to cure all of the things we've talked about, you know, all of the risk factors that we have. So if we have a chance to do that, we should address this, but we're not, or we're not in a systematic way. So it's not a medical problem. Like Saskia mentioned, it's a public health problem. And why is it a public health problem? Because the Ministry of Health that we have are not Ministry of Health, they're Ministry of Diseases. The whole system is focused on when people have a problem, show up, get treated. If we want to avoid a non-epidemic epidemic, we cannot wait for people to be demented. That's not how it works. So this is in the realm of public health. The incentives, I forget which country, but the financial incentives for the medical system, the whole medical system, not just doctors, everybody's on doctors, they're at the tip of the iceberg, but the whole system, the financial incentives are to treat you when you are sick, not to keep you healthy. If you switch people to not going to the hospital and doing everything so that you are not getting sick, we wouldn't do that for 20 years. We would be having a very different debate. But we're not doing that. We're putting massive amount of money into treating people once they are sick, and very few dollars comparatively to ensuring they don't get there. Now we're all going to die. We're all going to die of something. The whole idea is to compress it in as few years as possible, brain included. The brain can actually outlast most organs, function well beyond the lifetime of a heart or a liver or lungs in a reasonable capacity, right? If you take care of it in a good way, it will outlast all other organs. So there's no real fundamental biological reason why we couldn't do it. Right? So public health, you wanted one word, so I'll give you public health, that's one word. Oh, there you go.
That's why I wanted to highlight the financial incentive or the economic burden of dementia, right? Because it's all these people that can't work anymore, and it's all the costs associated with the health, with the care of these people. And sometimes, or always, we need those financial incentives to get changes made at the policy level, political level.
Could I add something as well, Stephanie? I very much agree with all the panelists said, but I think coming back to Simon's point about, or Simone's point, sorry, English, the Anglophone in me. I know that's true. Simon and Simone, we keep them separate. You're absolutely right, though. The incentive is we treat once you've gotten sick, and that's how our systems have been set up. That's also how we've set up our systems for aging. We think about aging as a disease state almost. You know, it's a to Natalie's point. It's a compared to when you were younger, you can't do this anymore. So it's a disability, not an ability. It's not an evolution. It's not just a change, and that also impacts then how we treat everything. And we can touch briefly on long-term care only because I think it's synonymous with the problem of how we think about aging, about older adults, and about dementia. A lot of the population of people who live in long-term care have dementia, and it's because they've gotten often to that stage where they can no longer live alone at home. They don't have the supports to be able to live at home. Their caregivers don't have the supports to be able to support them at home or in their community. Our community is not set up for people who are older and who might have changes in their ability. And so we take a bit of this warehousing approach of, okay, let's move to long-term care because now your daily needs are met, but not your purpose, not the fulfillment of what you might still be and want to be as an older adult. And I think that goes back to medicalizing everything. Again, in long-term care, the foundation of it emerged from addressing medical needs of being older. And to Simon's point, if you're in the ER or the ICU, we have horrible names. You're a bed blocker, and we need to get rid of you and move you out somewhere. And so we move you into long-term care because we've not thought through that earlier pathway of support for people and to enable them to live fulfilling lives where they want to live. Going back to that early risk reduction approach, if we incentivized our whole healthcare system, even from a time perspective, right now, on average, GPs have maybe 10 minutes max with a person to address all of their issues. I mean, that's not enough time to even have a conversation to understand what might have happened between the last appointment and this, right? So those are some of the things about the way we've set up our system that disincentivizes being able to address such a complex disease like dementia, which often people don't just have dementia, they do have many other diseases that all interact, and then they're aging, and there are all of those needs that come with it. So there's definitely never going to be a silver bullet to any of it because it requires a complete system approach to it.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you so much. This was very, very informative and insightful. I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. I'm not sure where did Douglas go. Let's see if we have some questions in the chat. So, yeah, if someone has any question in the audience, we have some.
Hi, thank you for coming. I have a question about 60 Minutes. Last Sunday, they had a report on a football player, 35 years old, who was injured, and he was given painkillers. He got hooked on these painkillers, and like he became a basket case. Even his family disavowed him. They gave up on him. And there was this doctor who, didn't operate. He uses what do you call it? it's like when you check on a pregnant woman, you know, with the ultrasound. Yeah, the ultrasound. And he was able to put like very small wires in his brain on top of the caustic protein, you know, the one that you're talking about. And he was able to reactivate the caustic protein, and the man was completely cured without any surgery. I don't know if anybody watched that. Actually, it was fascinating.
So did you have your question directed for a specific speaker? Or
You know.
Since you're all looking at me. All right, thank you. Great question. I did not see the 60 minutes. I don't know exactly the particular of that case, so I'll answer in general. One thing about being 35 and playing football, to me, the most likely reason why this happens is because of trauma, concussion, and impact. So already, even though you may end up with the same or roughly the same molecules or proteins, it may come from a completely different reason, right? Blue rust instead of red rust, but it's rust. It has an impact, but the source might be completely different. And therefore the cure, the treatment might also be different. This being said, in slow-moving Alzheimer's, and slow-moving is important. The disease we're talking about takes decades to build up, right? You may have evidence, and it may start in your 30s and 30s, it may accelerate, but it still takes decades to go through. There has been some studies, I know the group in Toronto actually has been trying that, to use a technique used in Parkinson's disease. Basically, if you think of the brain, the operation of the brain works on a battery principle. It's firing electricity. That's how neurons excite each other and they form a network. If this is mistiming, if the firing goes awry, or it's not sufficiently high, then the system, therefore, decreases. In Parkinson's disease, it is the case. In many patients, a specific region of the brain will be affected. If you literally put a needle into it, an antenna, and you stimulate electrically this region, think of it as a pacemaker for the brain, you will kickstart again the network. And this has instantaneous effect in Parkinson's disease patients. It's actually quite spectacular. It works really well. But practically, you need to have this very specific, in Parkinson, you need to have this very specific effect in this very specific region, because you're not about to, put tons of needles everywhere. You're not sure it's going to respond. In some people, it doesn't work. It's not a panacea. Without even talking about that being a neurosurgery that costs upwards of $50,000 just to prepare, and the surgery and the surgeon and you can't do that for everyone, right? Not even everybody gets a pacemaker for their heart. It's not simple. So while it's promising, they have tried this in Alzheimer's disease with a specific region of the brain called the hippocampus. It's about as big as your little finger. You have two of them, one on the left, one on the right. And it's a bit the relay for your memory. That's how you encode the memory, you store it away, and that's how you retrieve it. It all goes through the hippocampus. So this region starts not working, memory starts not to work. And they have stimulated the hippocampus and did give positive effects. Now, is this going to work on everybody? I don't know. And is this available as a solution to everybody? That is certainly not the case, unfortunately. We cannot start thinking that for the 500,000 people with dementia in Canada, they're all going to go through neurosurgery. So very interesting as a system, but not the solution. What it does indicate, though, is if we had something, let's say a drug, that could operate on produce the same effect, right? This could be a pathway that would be more accessible.
I think the only thing I want to add to Simon's point is not about any of the biology or the mechanism behind it, but that for the longest time when we thought about Alzheimer's or dementia, there wasn't a lot of hope. There, we really looked at it as a very bleak outcome. And I think we are not at a place where these treatments are all going to work for everyone. But certainly we're at a tipping point where we're starting to see some very, very early therapies beyond the class of drugs we've been dealing with for the past 20 years that could have other impact and can really start to maybe get at the underlying mechanism. I mean, again, Simone talked about it a bit before in terms of some of the newer drugs that are coming out. It's a class of drugs. It's an early class of drugs. It by no means has the impact that we want it to have, but there's hope in that there is effort going into this, that there are other drugs in the pipeline, there are other trials like the finger study and the Can Thumbs Up study, which is in Canada around lifestyle factors, and including for people who are living with dementia and how the impact of lifestyle can change things and impact their trajectory. So I think there is some hope to balance out the fact that these don't work the way we hope they would, and certainly they're really expensive.
Thanks. And just to pick up on Saskia's point, we have been talking about modifiable risk factors in terms of prevention. Oh, like, God, don't get dementia. Let's prevent it. But as you were discussing, these are also very positive lifestyle changes that will improve the health of people who are living with dementia or is in an earlier risk state that we refer to as mild cognitive impairment. These are older adults who are beginning to show some changes in their cognition that seems, more than what you would expect for normal aging. A meaningful percentage of them will go on and develop a dementia, but about a third of them won't. And things that help to maintain a healthy lifestyle and good health, even when you're beginning to show some changes, are very positive interventions. And we know that if you delay the symptoms of the onset of dementia, and that's defined by a change in your functioning, where you can't maintain your everyday functioning, look after your own needs, both in terms of food preparation, your household, financially. If you can delay that by about 5 years, then you cut in half about the number of cases in the population. So any of these factors that can, even if we're not preventing, but we're putting the brakes on, they're very, very meaningful.
Yeah, thank you very much for that intervention. So we have an online attendee, Timothy Daly, who does really excellent work on the ethics of prevention of dementia and about this equity aspect. So please introduce yourself. I would love to
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, well, thank you very much for the very interesting debate from different perspectives. I myself am actually like an interdisciplinary dementia researcher working here in Paris and Argentina, and I guess I'd just like to offer a bit of perspective and maybe just get some input from the panel. Because if taking a look at the whole debate, we've been talking about sort of biological, behavioural and public health perspectives, and I think what I found in my PhD was that, like, across these different levels, that even though we all recognise the complexity of dementia as a condition, there is kind of like a bit of an over-reliance on seductive ideas about dementia, and usually accompanied by some kind of short-sightedness. So I would say the two major sort of most seductive ideas about dementia are kind of like the amyloid lens on one hand, on the biology side, and then like the lifestyle lens on the other side. And both of those lenses in which we study dementia tend to have are basically pretty low impact, and the studies around them are usually full of different kinds of bias. And in both of those domains, we talk about what counts as modifiable. We talk about amyloid and amyloid reducing treatments as being disease modifying. On the side of lifestyle, we talk about modifiable risk factors. But so I think to me, there's like a real sort of, in terms of the future of dementia and the vision we have of it across biological, behavioural, and public health domains, like, who gets to define what's disease modifiable? What's a modifiable risk factor? Because I think we should change what we mean by modifiable. Because if we just take the example of sort of the lifestyle and public health stuff, well, deprivation is like a risk factor for dementia. It's been shown now, and it doesn't rely, so deprivation, just economic deprivation, just simply being on the wrong side of health gradients, social health gradients, by being, because of your socioeconomic status, is an independent risk factor without mediation through lifestyle. And this has been kind of, just now on the side of amyloid, the industry's desire to remove amyloid, well, I think on the side of lifestyle, I feel like there's almost like a desire to not take into account those kinds of considerations, because from a policy point of view, it's much more messy to have to deal with things like deprivation. It's much easier to get people doing lifestyle stuff, but it doesn't actually go very far. If we imagine dementia risk as like an iceberg, it doesn't even scratch the surface, like looking just at lifestyle. We need to look at deeper structures in society, and things like matching, curing, and care funding, and also like inventing new visions of dementia across, inspired by policy and biology, I think. So I basically, if I had to summarize it, like, I don't know whether the panel would agree with me, but basically just avoiding any form of like short-term over-reliance on any one strategy. So whether that's on the side of like biology or on the side of behavior, and instead like imagining, like Margaret Lock did like 10 years ago with the Alzheimer's conundrum, trying to imagine like a society that really takes into account the complexity of dementia and plans for that with long-term measures in ways that tackle these health gradients, and also over-reliance on reductive biological explanations that don't seem to give the kind of impact that we'd like. So just avoiding the seductive ideas that sound nice but maybe actually don't go very far in terms of actually achieving equitable and efficacious prevention. I feel like those would be, avoiding those seductive ideas would be very useful. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Anyway, thank you very much for the very interesting panel.
Thank you very much. I don't know if one of the panelists want to comment.
Yeah, no, I'm going to kind of jump in, because I think there's some really great points that are tied into that. And the first thing to say, one thing you can change is behaviour. So by definition, it's modifiable because it's the things you do and don't do. But I think what you raise is a really critical piece, and what I said at the very beginning. Behavior change is simple. Behavior change in context isn't. And so, that's why I'm deprivation. No individual can change deprivation, but policy can change deprivation, right? It's still part of the behavior change process. Now, the other thing that becomes really important, tying this all together, going back to the inequalities. So, certain interventions. So one of the things, I'm going to beat up my field for a moment, because this is something historically that behavior change researchers have done very poorly. They have not really considered the broader context of how they've developed their interventions. So I know Finger quite well. Theoretically fantastic, in a context of a trial, does a very nice job, totally devoid of reality that sits behind it. So translating that actually into clinical change is really difficult to do, because it was never developed with the context of clinical change. Lots of really smart people sitting there going, being more physically active is good, changing diet's good, having, people work out their brain is good, etc., and coming from this very theoretical perspective, throwing this package together and then just giving it in a very controlled environment where, people are being paid probably to participate in the study, and everything's all everything's overseen, money is no object, etc., etc. Yes, fantastic. But in reality, it falls apart. So a lot of the work personally that I do, and a lot of the work I do around methodology, is to really get people to reconceptualize the development of interventions that are implementable. So as soon as you start thinking about an intervention, you've automatically got to start thinking about the context you want to deliver it in. And that becomes critical, because universal interventions on behavior change aren't going to work. So So I think you're right. I think so number one, we need to do a better job of developing our interventions. We need a better job of thinking about the various levels at which our interventions need to occur at. So Susan Mickey, who's one of the phenomenal researchers in the field of behavioral interventions, talks about, intervention at the individual, community, policy level as a connected system of things, and you need that. And then, we talk a lot of space has been given to the idea of personalized medicine, and it's really been taken to sort of think about it in a pharmaceutical kind of perspective. If we understand the individual, we can give them the right cocktail of drugs and it works. Actually, we've been doing personalized medicine for many, many years on the lifestyle side of things. Each intervention has to be adapted to the individual, we know that. But actually taking that one step further, right, and thinking about, the broader community pieces, about where you deliver interventions, how you deliver interventions, and how you make them meaningful. And that becomes really important as well. So I 100% agree. But I'm with the broader concept that this element of multiple levels needs to be integrated, but I still wouldn't give up on the idea that we need to target the things that we can target and that we can change. We just have to be more sophisticated about how we do our science to understand that and how we develop the interventions to be able to deliver that. And we need to really focus on the bigger policy and system pieces that need to come along with that to make it possible for people to engage in these various interventions and treatments we come up with.
Yeah, exactly. I like that idea of continuing to target those lifestyle behaviors, but also trying to increase access, increase resources for people that might not have those resources.
And just one thing, I never talk about lifestyle because lifestyle is a complex word. And a lot of lifestyle is driven by your circumstance. And a lot of it we can't actually control. So that's why I always talk about behaviors and behavior change and health behaviors, because you can control your behaviors in any circumstance. Behavior change may not be exactly the same for every individual, but you have that capacity to do something different. Even if it's small, you can always work on those things.
Yeah, thank you for that precision. So the discussion has been really amazing. I won't keep you too much longer from the food though. I'm getting very hungry myself, and we have a buffet waiting for us at the back. So thank you to everyone who participated in the event and really made it a success. A special thanks to Jackie and Douglas from Fort Space, to Joseph and Javier, I got that right, of the Public Scholar Program. And of course, thanks to our panelists for bringing their view on this really important topic. So please go enjoy the food and talk to each other, and we have the space for a little bit longer now. Thank you.